Hello there. So I don't have a lot of time to record this, so I hope I do it pretty quickly. It's been a pretty hectic week, and actually a few hectic weeks, just because of classes, and one of my classes ended and another one was beginning, and it's been nuts. So I'm going to try to keep this as short and sweet as possible so I can get back to my schoolwork and the blog work that I need to do still, and pretty much everything else in my life. We're midway through October. Actually, we're probably a little bit further than midway through October by the time this gets uploaded. But we're midway through the season for Halloween, so I hope everybody out there has been enjoying some Halloween-related activities. I know I love watching the Halloween Baking Championship and the other baking championships because I love the creativity that goes along with those cake designs and dessert designs in general. It's pretty crazy. Please don't mind the technical difficulties. I had a whole section here, but for some reason it got cut. I don't know how, but it did. Last Friday, I posted my short story, Shifter's Hunter. If you haven't read it yet, I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check that out, as well as my other short story, The Shadow. Both of them are kind of creepy and go along with kind of the Halloween theme I have going, so I definitely recommend checking those out. One of the most popular Halloween costumes out there is the vampire, and that's particularly on the scary end of things. But unlike Frankenstein and the Banshee from my last video and blog, vampires are extremely popular and really have been for a very long time, and definitely in media. So from Dracula to Twilight and beyond, you have so many iterations to go from in media that they're almost free reign at this point. And you can be very creative with them if you do some of the main things correctly. One of my favorite ways to make vampires more modern is that they have to use a blood bank to get their supply of blood, or that they have to make synthetic blood of some kind, which usually means that they are very rich in some ways because they can make the synthetic blood and so on. The health benefits of using synthetic blood means that there's no blood shortage and blah, 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 that sort of thing. It's very interesting, and I love those kinds of stories. But as with most mythical creatures, if you are going to write about them, you gotta have most, or at least some, of the key factors that make something a vampire. And this goes for pretty much any mythical creature, whether you're talking about fairies or werewolves or any sort of thing. You gotta have some key factors that will bring us back to remembering this is a vampire, this is a werewolf, this is a fairy, this is a god, whatever. You gotta have these main characteristics. They must drink blood to survive. They are technically undead, though there is some leeway. The sun affects them somehow, though I am partial to them burning in the sunlight as opposed to sparkling. They are very good looking, which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint if you think about it, and they are stronger and faster than the average human. Now notice I didn't put on there that they turn into bats or wolves or anything. You don't have to have that for it to be a vampire, because there are a lot of iterations that they don't do that. And that's the same with, they don't necessarily have to have covens, though that is a very fun aspect of many vampire stories and how they live amongst themselves as well as out in the community. Also, they don't have to have a feud with werewolves, although it is kind of a precedent at this point that there is some sort of feud between them because, at least in the past, they hunted humans, so it kind of makes sense. But again, they don't necessarily have to have a feud. Now, the modern vampire is usually inspired by Dracula at some point or another. And they say that Dracula was inspired by a man named Vlad the Impaler, who essentially was a Romanian warlord. His favorite way of executing was impaling, therefore in his name. However, he is not the only inspiration for the modern Dracula-like vampire. You can actually see vampiric creatures, not necessarily called vampires, all the way in ancient texts and ancient mythology. If you've been watching this for any amount of time, you know I love mythology. And that means we're going to go into all those different versions. Now, nowadays, vampires are most associated with the Europeans, but they really weren't the first to have these vampiric creatures. In fact, nearly every culture in the world has some sort of creature or demon that sucks, drinks, or eats blood of some kind or flesh. There's a reason for it. As humans, we learned a very long time ago how important blood is. The loss of it, excessive loss of it, caused death, and people could see that from wars and all that way before we ever came up with the term vampire. Now, we're not going to get into the whole bloodletting thing to solve medical problems because obviously that was stupid. The Mesopotamians, ancient Greeks and Romans, and Hebrews all had blood-sucking demons or spirits in their mythologies. Even the devil in Christianity was considered what we would describe as a vampire due to tales of him consuming blood. The Persians were one of the first cultures that we know of with these sort of tales, as were shown on their pottery shards. In ancient Babylonia, Lilitu was a female shape-shifting demon who drank blood, which is usually associated with the Hebrew Lilith. The ancient Greeks, appropriated later by the Romans, believed in a creature known as the Lamia, who snuck into the rooms of children to suck their blood. And then there was Apusa, daughter of the goddess Hecate, who shifted into a young woman to seduce men and drink their blood as the men slept. Sounds very Dracula-esque, right? And then, of course, we get to medieval Europe, where vampiric hunts were just as common as witch hunts. We kind of hear more about the witch hunts nowadays, partially just because they were just that infamous, and that literally it was impossible for a woman to do anything without being accused of being a witch. But vampirism was definitely a no-no as well. I believe there was a noble by the name of Elizabeth who was caught bathing in blood. Let's just say she was called everything in the book. Throughout the medieval era and beyond, there were vampiric stories that even continued into the 18th century. That would be about the 1700s. On the sober side of history, we can generally attribute this to premature burials. One of the reasons that eventually they developed the graveyard shift was to make sure that nobody was rising from the graves. But people were very often buried before they were actually dead. How this happened, I'm not entirely sure. I guess they didn't know how to check a pulse at the time. If they were, they would ring the bell, and the person on the graveyard shift would have to come over, dig them out. I'm sure a lot of them were monitored afterwards to make sure they weren't a witch or a vampire or any other sort of horrific undead creature. Ugh, very glad we live in the modern day. Can you imagine waking up and being buried under 6 feet of soil, dirt, and all that kind of nastiness, possibly with other bones around you? Alright, so let's look at pop culture and all the iterations that I could find of vampires. Dracula, of course, is the most classic and most well known. He has had so many iterations you can't even count. And yeah, there's so many iterations of Dracula. And you can find him just about everywhere if you look up vampires. He is the first thing that will come up if you type in vampire on Google, I promise. I do have to mention Twilight simply because of its popularity and the surgence of popularity since the new book came out. What is it, Midnight Sun? I'm personally not a fan. I don't really care for the sparkly vampire bit, mostly because I associate the sparkly with fairies, and I have been known to call the Twilight vampires just blood-sucking fairies. To me, the Twilight vampires are actually just a vampire and a fairy mixed together, and in some cultures they might just be considered the same thing. And now I get to talk about Underworld. This is probably one of my favorite ways that vampires have been portrayed. They're not bad guys, they're not good guys either. There's a mixture of both. Same thing with the werewolves on their side. But what I love about it is just how badass everybody is. They're super strong. It's not entirely clear how they get their blood, but it is kind of clear that they kind of steer clear of humans in general. And they live in covens, and they are like several different covens, and it's really fun. I really love just everything about Underworld. I know it's a bit old at this point. I think the first movie came out somewhere in the early 2000s, so it's going on probably 15, 20 years by now. Oh geez, I'm old. And if you're going to talk about vampires, you better be talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Great TV show. I really got into it towards the end of the series, after Angel had left, but every time I've come across Buffy or Angel, it's always been a blast. So definitely a great series to check out. Again, I know it's a little old for some people here on the internet, but it's a classic and you should watch it anyway. And of course, I have to talk about The Assassin's Daughter and the new book, which I have yet to read. I can't wait to read it though. The Assassin's Revenge. Now, the first book does have vampires in it, but they didn't really play a huge role. They were a big part of it, at least in the world building, but again, not so much in the entire story. But I have the feeling that they will have a more prominent place in the following books. And if you have read The Assassin's Daughter, you will probably know why I'm saying. I'm not going to give anything away because, again, I haven't actually read the second book yet, and I cannot wait to read it. I'm excited for it, so when I do finally read it, I will be posting a review on my website, audreybwilson.com/blogs. So keep a lookout for that. I'll make an announcement when I do that. And before I go any further and conclude this video, I am not the biggest fan of vampires. I do enjoy them on occasion, and I have to be in the mood for them. I tend to prefer werewolf stories, and I'm not entirely sure why. I love them both, but I tend to focus on more shifters than I do on vampires. So sorry to all those vampire fans, but again, not the biggest fan, but I do absolutely enjoy them because they are scary, or they can be scary, or they can be sparkly and weird. Anyway, if you are a huge fan of vampires and vampire stories, Definitely leave some recommendations in the comments below. I will try to get to them if and when I have the time. Obviously, with school going on, it's a little hard to do a lot of the things that I would normally do. I'm reading a lot of textbooks instead of fiction, so yeah, I will get to it when I can, particularly once I'm done with school. But I look forward to seeing your recommendations and what you guys think about vampires. As always, thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to check out Shifter's Hunter and The Shadow on my website, audreyWilson.com, link in the description below. You can also read my narrative poetry and get to know my works in progress on the website as well. You can go to Works and click on any one of those tabs. Please sign up for the newsletter to receive updates on the works in progress, any short stories or poetry that's coming out, and soon there will be access to the worlds that I have been creating and the characters I've been creating that maybe you might want to check out. And when I get closer to actually publishing my works in progress, you will get some sneak peeks. So please sign up for that newsletter so you can receive sneak peeks and special access to my brain. Anyway, I hope you have an amazing Halloween season. Until next time.